There was a day when the earth itself seemed to choose a side. Hooves thundered like distant thunder. Steel flashed against sun. Women moved through smoke and blood with the certainty of hunters, a dark tide of blades and courage. Across the field, horses reared and tumbled, riders swallowed by dust. On one flank rode the Oyo Cavalry thunder incarnate, lances leveled, a wall of speed and shock. On the other stood the Dahomey Amazons, steel-eyed, disciplined, trained to meet death as a companion. The world called it a battle. The people who survived called it an apocalypse of honor. This is the story of that day, the tactics, the terror, the devotion. This is the story of how thunder met the Lionesses, and how, for a few sunburned hours, the map of power in West Africa trembled. The late 17th and early 18th centuries in West Africa were not the slow, unchanging tableau once painted in distant atlases. They were a furnace of states, courts, of capitals, trade routes that bled wealth, and militaries constantly refined by contact and conflict. In the north, the Oyo Empire expanded, riding the tide of cavalry innovation. Horses, bred and trained, became instruments of statecraft. Oyo kings forged alliances, marshaled tributaries, and maintained an army that moved with a terrifying, rehearsed tempo. Their cavalry squadrons were the steel fist of a polity that governed markets, marshes, and crossroads. To the south, the kingdom of Dahomey rose from the coastal thickets, sharpening itself into a state of ruthless efficiency. Dahomey organized its men, and strikingly its women, into units of fierce warriors. The Agoji, known in stories as the Dahomey Amazons, were not myth. They were a professional corps, hand-picked, trained from youth, and sworn to a discipline that placed honor before life. Politics pushed these two worlds toward the same fields: competition for trade, control of fertile hinterlands, prestige, and survival. When two powers of such different temperaments meet, the result is not merely a battle. It is a searing bell that measures who will shape the centuries to come. The Oyo Cavalry was not simply a formation, it was a doctrine. Commanders arranged their men in wedges and lines, rehearsing timed charges that turned speed into a cutting edge. Horses were trained to loosen in the dust, to obey subtle reins, to bear the shock of lance and spear. Armor was pragmatic leather, sometimes scale, often enhanced with iron breastplates for high-value commanders. Tactics emphasized mobility and shock. The wedge, a triangular formation with a point of impact, punched through infantry lines. Flanking squadrons would ride in circles, compressing and isolating units. Reserve riders waited for the precise moment to cut down a routed foe. Drummers, trumpeters, and horns regulated tempo. When the beat quickened, the flank tightened. When the horn roared, the wedge drove. Logistics supported the cavalry's dominance. Supply lines moved grain and fodder. Scouts mapped the terrain. Vanguard riders probed for marshes and gullies that could trap a charge. On a broad plain, Oyo riders were gods of the field, capable of transforming a small skirmish into a decisive victory within minutes. Yet the same strengths were also vulnerabilities. Horses needed room to build speed. In marshes, dense forests, or narrow passes, the cavalry's advantage could evaporate. The ancients taught their sons that a rider is only as strong as the ground under his hooves. The women of Dahomey were shaped in a crucible of ritual and training. From early adolescence, they learned footwork, musket drill, spear thrusts, and hand-to-hand violence. They moved as units, not as irregular bands. Their corps had ranks, commanders, and a code, unflinching loyalty, single-minded focus, and a culture that sanctified sacrifice. Armament was hybrid and adaptive. Early on, they adopted muskets for volley fire. For the close phase, they wielded machetes, iron-tipped spears, and heavy blades designed to hack through leather and bone. Rope lassos and grappling hooks complemented steel devices to pull riders from saddles or to trip a galloping horse. Armor was lighter than cavalry plate. Mobility was prized. They could sprint across broken ground where horses faltered. Tactics emphasized terrain and cohesion. The Amazons preferred ambushes from cover, staged retreats that lured riders into swamps, and sudden countercharges into flanks. Discipline kept them steady under cavalry pressure, volley after volley, then rush in with blades while the enemy reformed. Their battlefield psychology was forged by ritual, a belief in ancestral protection, and a code that made fear a rare commodity. To meet the Dahomey unit in open charge was to meet a running wall of resolve. They did not flee. They layered obstacles, felled trees, and dug pits. Every inch of the ground could become a trap. Where the Oyo sought to impose momentum, the Amazons crafted friction. Battles are decided long before the first horn. The day chosen, the ground surveyed, and the sun's angle all conspired to decide which doctrine would reign. Dahomey commanders selected terrain intentionally. Marsh fringes, a lattice of reed beds, and narrow clearings between groves that would reduce the cavalry's room to maneuver. Their scouts reported bogs and gullies, places where horse hooves could sink and break formations. Oyo scouts mapped the landscape in the days before, noting ridge lines for observation and open plains for charges. The king's strategists argued for the speed advantage. Their confidence was not arrogance alone. Oyo victories had been won with similar economy of force. But this field would not be a mirror of past battles. It would be a test of doctrine versus deception. As dawn bled into day, both armies formed. Colors rose on poles. War drums began the slow call for sacrifice. Men checked weapons. Women bound their hair and singed prayers. Merchants and envoys withdrew. The generals closed colors and announced final orders. The silence before contact was heavy with the sense that history would be remade in a matter of hours. The initial thunder was predictable and terrifying. Oyo squadrons advanced in disciplined rhythm, lances lowered, points aimed like lightning bolts. For a moment, the field seemed to hold its breath as cavalry geometry tightened. Then the first crash. Horses met rifle fire. The Amazons opened with coordinated volleys. Muskets barked in synchronized death, designed not to annihilate every rider, but to unnerve mounts and fracture the cohesion of the charge. A horse stumbling could topple 3 men. A herd skidding in a crush would create a choke point. The first line of Oyo felt the sting. Wounds, splintered lances, falling bodies. Yet training propelled them forward. Lances still found flesh. Infantry auxiliaries, where present, tried to hold the line and push the Amazons back. Then the flanking maneuvers began. Oyo riders spiraled outward, trying to wrap the Amazons and compress them into a killing pocket. The Amazons had anticipated this. Hidden squadrons sprung from groves to cut support lines. Rope teams darted out to snare riders. Grappling hooks felled the occasional commander. Every attempted Oyo encirclement met a counterstitch, a small squad of Amazons rushing through the underbrush to pierce the enemy's exposed back. The clash was not clean. It was a tangle of blade and hoof, of smoke and shriek. Formation broke, reformed, and broke again. The sun bore witness to a choreography of innovation. Oyo adaptation against Dahomey craft. The battle moved in clear phases. Each phase was a dialectic. Oyo force against Dahomey cunning. Understanding these phases reveals why the day was both a tragedy and a military masterclass. Phase 1. Shock and countershock. The cavalry's initial shock sought to split the Amazons open. Volleys interrupted momentum. Where a cavalry wedge met a hedge of bodies and bayonets, it slowed. Where it found clear ground, it thundered through. Both sides took heavy losses. Phase 2. Attrition and ambush. After the first shocks, the Amazons deployed ambush teams. Men and women slipped through reed beds to cut off supply lines. Horses that wandered into soggy ground sank up to their bellies. Oyo commanders, seeing flanks threatened, pulled reserves to seal breaches. Reserves that the Amazons exploited, drawing them into kill zones. Phase 3. Close quarter ferocity. Once cavalry momentum lessened, the fighting became savage and personal. Muskets were clumsy at arm's length. Blades and clubs ruled. Amazons used short, brutal blades and grappling ropes. Oyo riders, deprived of momentum, had to fight dismounted or attempt desperate cavalry melees that favored strength over speed. Phase 4. Collapse and extraction. As daylight faded, exhaustion and attrition reshaped the field. Units broke. Commanders issued retreat orders. Retrieval teams gathered the wounded. Some units refused order, seeking one last burst of honor. The survivors on both sides carried not only the scars of battle, but the memory of comrades who had held lines until they could not. Among the cacophony, moments emerged that would become legend. The colonel stories shouted by survivors into the night and later sung to children by the fireside. There was the Amazon commander, who, seeing her right flank collapse, grabbed a fallen lieutenant's flag and rode forward with a small band, crashing into a cavalry column and shattering its rhythm. Men who watched later could not say if it was strategy or sacrament. Either way, the charge bought time for others to withdraw. A veteran Oyo rider, pierced by multiple blades, leaned against his horse and drove his lance into the last line before he fell. His act sealed an opening that allowed 2 squadrons to escape certain death. There were also quieter kinds of heroism. A young Amazon who closed her eyes and chanted names of ancestors while tending a wounded comrade. A medic who dragged both friend and enemy from the mud, refusing to distinguish by flag. These acts, stitched into oral memory, made the field a place where cruelty and compassion shared a single horizon. And there were the horrors, children's toys trampled in the grass, a convoy of traders found with arrow wounds, a priest praying over the broken door of a village hearth. The battlefield collected all human contradictions. As the sun slid west, a critical tactical question emerged. Could steady cavalry break an adaptive infantry that refused to collapse? The Oyo tried everything. They massed lancers for a final wedge, concentrated volleys to thin the Amazons' ranks, and used their best commanders to hold collapsing wings. The Amazons answered with an unyielding doctrine. Do not allow a single cavalry charge to convert to momentum. Fight the horses at first contact. Deny them space. Strike their riders when they were exposed. In several episodes, the Amazons baited a charge, feigning a retreat only to pivot and pour flanking musket fire into the sides as horses ran past. Horses were sensitive animals. Once distrust enters a mount, its utility plummets. At a critical moment, a large Oyo wedge found a thin seam in the Dahomey line and punched through. For minutes, the field was a corridor of slaughter. But the Amazons surged in from hidden groves, their ropes snaring stirrups and their blades hacking at flanks. The wedge stalled. The veteran riders, forced into hand-to-hand combat against resolute women, faltered. What began as a potential breakthrough dragged into grinding attrition. It was a testament to discipline and adaptation on both sides. Night approached like a blanket. Commanders on both sides had to decide press on or live to fight another day. Exhaustion, dwindling ammunition, and stretched supply lines argued for cessation. Pride and fear argued to continue. Where retreats began, they were dangerous. Routed cavalry or fleeing infantry could be prey to nocturnal ambush. Some units managed disciplined withdrawals, covering each other's flanks. Others splintered into smaller bands, chased by opportunistic raiders. The center of the field remained a churn of bodies, horses, and smoke for hours. When the last trumpet finally faded, the field was a testimony to intensity. Thousands wounded, hundreds dead in the mud, banners tattered and planted at odd angles, and a silence that spoke louder than any drum. Each side counted its losses, tallied its debts, and measured honor by who stood when the dawn returned. The answer is never simple. Militarily, Oyo's cavalry had held certain tactical advantages, and on a broad reading, many of their objectives were met. But they paid dearly to claim those gains. They returned with fewer horses, many veterans limping, and the knowledge that the Amazons could not be easily routed. Dahomey, for its part, had demonstrated that carefully cultivated units of disciplined infantry, especially those led by women, could blunt and even reverse the dominance of cavalry when they chose the ground. The Amazons still bore scars and lost many of their number, yet their legend grew. They were not annihilated. They were tempered. Politically, both states recalibrated. Oyo commanders understood the limits of speed. They invested in scouts, in combined arms, in methods to deal with mire and cover. Dahomey embraced new weapons while honing its ambush arts. The ripples of the day reshaped recruitment, tactics, and diplomacy. Allies and enemies watched closely. The battlefield was a lesson carved into the policies of both kingdoms. Memory does strange work. Poets and griots made the day into myth without erasing its truth. Songs spun the deeds of commanders into lines of beauty and suffering. Children's games reenacted the charge. Elders pointed at the ridge where an Amazon leader once raised a blade. Warriors tattooed symbols to remember their dead. History, as it was later recorded, filtered facts through politics. Colonial observers wrote down versions calibrated to their sensibilities. Yet in the villages, oral tradition guarded a different archive. The names of the brave, the manner of sacrifice, and the geometry of ambush sites. Museums collected artifacts. Storytellers kept the sound of the drums. Together, they stitched a fuller fabric of remembrance. Today, the legend of the Dahomey Amazons and the thunder of the Oyo cavalry live in museums, in films, and in the pulse of descendants. The clash is studied in military academies for its lessons on combined arms and asymmetric warfare. But it remains, above all, a human story of adaptation, valor, and the cost of empire. The field teaches several lessons. First, technology and tactic are inseparable. A cavalry doctrine undefeated for decades can be unmade by terrain and ingenuity. Second, the human element, discipline, sacrifice, and improvisation can negate material advantage. Third, memory matters. Oral traditions preserve tactical knowledge that archives sometimes miss. From the vantage of centuries, the battle shows how states evolve. Oyo modernized aspects of its military, while Dahomey refined its tactics and diplomatic strategies. The world beyond West Africa watched and took note. The intellectual currents of statecraft flowed from these fields into broader continental practice. More broadly, this clash is a mirror. It reflects the complexity of African histories that are too often flattened into distant generalities. Here was a continent where women fought at state scale, where cavalry and infantry met with equal ferocity, and where political futures were decided in hours of terrible, brilliant violence. The ridge still remembers. The grasses that cover the bones remember. The drumbeat that once called men and women to fate echoes faintly in festivals, in lullabies, and in the selection of a warrior's name. This was not merely a battle of horses and blades. It was a contest over how communities would survive and define themselves. It was a calibration of courage and consequence. The thunder met the lionesses, and the story left marks on the land and on people that no treaty could erase. Listen to the songs, read the old stories and the new, recall the names. When the world asks what greatness looked like in those sun-struck fields, remember, it was messy, it was terrible, and it was magnificent. If this story moved the heart and changed the view of a continent's past, subscribe for more deep cinematic histories from Africa's untold battlefields. Share the story, honor the memory,